Hello and welcome to WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks and these are the top headlines of the hour. Russia rehearses its response to a nuclear attack as tensions mount over the Kremlin's unsubstantiated claim that Ukraine is planning to deploy a dirty bomb. French President Emmanuel Macron hosts German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, with the leaders hoping to pare back differences on energy and defence and revitalise the EU's key double act. The United States, Japan and South Korea warn that an unparalleled scale of response will be warranted if North Korea conducts a seventh test of a nuclear weapon. Beijing shuts down an amusement park and the cities of Wuhan and Guangzhou lock down some districts as a preventative measure after COVID-19 cases in China creep higher despite the country's zero COVID policy. And thousands of Iranians flock to Mahsa Amini's grave despite the regime's crackdown. A memorial ceremony marked the 40th day since the 22-year-old's death in custody, with reports that security forces opened fire at protesters gathered at the cemetery. We begin today with an escalation of the dispute between the US and Saudi Arabia over oil production. Saudi Arabia's energy minister has blasted the release of emergency oil stocks by the Biden administration, calling it an attempt to manipulate markets. The Saudis also called themselves the mature side in the standoff, comments that fuel a war of words between the White House and Riyadh after a decision earlier this month by the Saudi-dominated OPEC Plus group of oil producers to curb production. They're cutting it by 2 million barrels a day starting in November, precisely the opposite move that the White House wanted to see. Last week, US President Joe Biden announced he would release another 15 million barrels from America's strategic oil reserves. That's a supply of oil that the United States holds in reserve for use during times of emergency. The White House was infuriated by the OPEC Plus decision and accused the Saudis of aligning themselves with Russia in the war on Ukraine. Since the invasion of Ukraine began in February, Russia's importance in energy markets has been reaffirmed by the International Energy Agency, which said the global oil market will still need Russian oil to flow, even with the planned price cap being imposed by the US and Europe as part of their sanctions packages. The G7 nations supported the price cap as a mechanism that would allow Russian oil to continue flowing, but at lower than market prices. But China and India have not signed on to the idea, raising questions about its ultimate efficacy. With China and India large purchasers of Russian crude, Moscow could evade the price cap by shipping most of its oil to countries that do not enforce the sanctions. With the approaching winter, demand for energy is of course expected to increase in the Northern Hemisphere, and President Biden has his own anxieties about the price of petrol at America's pumps ahead of midterm elections in just 2 weeks' time. For more on all of this, I'm joined from Riyadh today by Colonel David Desroches. He's a professor at the Near East South Asia Centre for Strategic Studies at the National Defence University. Colonel Desroches, thank you very much indeed for being with us today. I mean, the Saudis are accusing the United States of trying to manipulate the markets. The Americans, of course, would argue that it's OPEC Plus that is manipulating the markets. This seems to be, at the very least, a total rhetorical standoff between Washington and Riyadh now.
Well, I would say it's a standoff. It's an opportunity. I don't see, quite frankly, why the Saudi oil minister chose to intervene at this time. The amount of money the amount of oil being released is less than 6 days of price cut production. It's really a trivial amount, and it's for distribution within the United States, basically trying to drop gasoline prices in the United States, probably in the run-up to the election. So I think that this would have been a good opportunity to just stay quiet. I think that the domestic critics of President Biden have enough to say about this in a way that Biden will pay attention to. And quite frankly, it's going to make it harder for the two sides to reconcile, as they inevitably will have to after the midterm elections are over.
But what does that reconciliation look like? I mean, it's just a matter of weeks since President Biden took an enormous geopolitical gamble. That picture of the fist bump with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man, of course, accused by American intelligence of being the architect of the murder and dismemberment of Saudi-American journalist Jamal Khashoggi, an effort that the United States was making to breathe some fresh life into what had become pretty chilly ties between Washington and Riyadh. And now the White House definitely feels as though the Saudis have pulled the rug out from beneath Joe Biden. So what does the path to reconciliation after the midterms look like?
Good question. Well, first, both sides, I think, need to take a look at what each side actually has done and what each side wants. I think that what we have here is a lot of misperception. Joe Biden, in going to Riyadh, thought that he did a great favor, sort of wiped the slate clean. But as soon as he emerged from his meeting, he said, "Oh yeah, I raised this issue with Jamal Khashoggi." From the Saudi perspective, I think they said, okay, any benefit this trip has just been negated. So, Joe Biden irritated his base, made what I thought was a bold geopolitical move. But then in the Saudi eyes, that didn't count for anything because of his remarks immediately after it. By the same token, the Saudis, who seem to want to keep gasoline prices in the United States high in order to inflict political pain on President Biden in the midterm elections, have miscalculated that all of America, or almost all of America, is behind the effort to resist Putin's colonial war in the Ukraine, and that high energy prices are seen as Putin's number one weapon. The Saudis have misjudged that. So both sides have to come to a recognition of the true positions of their other sides. And I think that, quite frankly, this is an opportunity to just shut up and let events take their course for a little bit, do a reassessment, and then come together.
And what of the pressure that President Biden is feeling from some of his fellow Democrats on Capitol Hill who are making moves to try and propose an embargo on fresh weapon sales to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, good question. So this is something that the Saudis often miss, which is President Biden's party contains a large and after the elections, it will probably be a larger percentage of members who don't want to sell weapons to any country that has a poor human rights records, and certainly don't want to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. To be fair, there's already been numerous examinations of the weapons. And even, Senator Menendez, for example, said, unless these weapons are needed. So the weapons that are actually being sold, like Patriot anti-missile defenses, those will continue to go on under most proposals. But just speaking these words, putting this on the table, it makes the Saudis nervous, and it makes them wonder if, perhaps they should diversify their sources of supply. Weapons shutoffs have been proposed many times in the past for many countries. It's very rare that the United States has gone through with it, because when we look at it, we only sell countries weapons that we think they need. countries don't get everything they ask for. And I know this is unusual. People don't see it, but generally countries ask for more weapons than the United States is willing to sell. It's not the other way around. So again, this is something that perhaps once the heat of the election is over, if people don't say anything that will be too hard to take back, we can have an honest assessment of our goals and our relationship, which the relationship is more than oil.
Fascinating days in the relationship between Washington and Riyadh. Yeah. Colonel David Desroches of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Thanks very much indeed for joining us from Riyadh. I hope we'll see you again.
You shall. Thank you.
Now, moving on, President Biden has again issued a stark warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin about serious consequences that will follow any use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The warnings come as Russia continues to claim that Ukraine is planning to use a dirty bomb on its own soil. The US and its allies now fear that Russia is planning to launch a false flag operation to justify its use of conventional nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
I spent a lot of time today talking about that. Let me just say, Russia would be making an incredibly serious mistake if we're to use a tactical nuclear weapon. I'm not guaranteeing you that it's a false flag operation yet. Don't know. But it would be a serious, serious mistake.
The Kremlin in recent days has claimed that Ukraine plans to detonate a rudimentary bomb that might disperse nuclear or chemical materials over a large area. Western officials call those claims nonsense. They point out that Ukraine has no nuclear capability of its own and insist there is no evidence to support the Russian assertions. President Biden said yesterday he is still unsure as to whether Russia is engaged in a false flag operation. Reports that Russia has been using Iranian-supplied drones to launch suicide attacks in Ukraine have sparked fresh international concern. Moscow and Tehran have consistently denied the accusations, but the West claims it has evidence. And now Israel says it's willing to share intelligence that can prove Iranian drones packed with explosives have deliberately been flown into civilian and strategic targets in Ukraine. Israel's president is currently in Washington. He'll be meeting US President Biden shortly here. The issues are high on the agenda.
No doubt, Iran is an enormous challenge, and we greatly appreciate the United States' support. In the face of those who would jeopardize our security and destabilize our world, we must stand firm, hand in hand.
And of course, as you said, we are standing together against the dangerous, destabilizing, and terrorizing actions that Iran is taking in the region, and as you noted, well beyond the region. The provision of drones by Iran to Russia to enable its further aggression against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people is showing horrific results on the ground in Ukraine, and it's something that we are determined to stand against.
If the claims are proven to be true, Iran could see more UN sanctions because the shipment of drones violates UN resolutions. The US, France and Britain have already requested the Security Council to voice its concern, but with Russia, a permanent member of the Council, enjoying veto powers, there is no prospect of much movement. The EU has agreed separate sanctions against 3 Iranian individuals and 1 entity. Back on October the 17th, residents in Kiev woke up to the sounds of a number of explosions and sirens. Multiple blasts were heard across the city, and at least 5 people were reported dead. Ukraine blamed Russia for using Iranian drones. Kiev claims that more than 220 of the airborne craft have been shot down in a month. The drones are designed by Iran-based Shahed Aviation Industries. The Shahed 136 is a loitering drone that is designed to neutralize targets on the ground. It's a new weapon that only came into service just last year. Its speed and size makes it difficult to track and destroy. It flies at around 185 kilometers per hour. It weighs around 200 kilograms. Israel has a vested interest here. The country has been a staunch critic of Iran and has called for tougher sanctions, not just over the suicide drones, but also regarding Iran's violations of the 2015 international nuclear deal. Now, here in the United States of America, early polls suggest that a majority of Latino voters plan to back Democratic candidates in next month's midterm elections. But that support for Democrats seems to be declining, with the elections now less than 2 weeks away. WION's US correspondent Susan Tehrani has this report.
Historically, left-leaning Latino voters are shifting toward the GOP with the potential to swing major races come November's midterm elections. Hispanic communities where Donald Trump made gains in 2020 are now coming into sharp focus, especially in South Texas.
We used to be the minority, but now we've grown so much and people are advocating more for the Latino vote, and we have so many people that are standing up and, making their voices heard where we used to not have it before.
The battle for Texas's 15th congressional district between Republican Monica De La Cruz and Democrat Michelle Vallejo is arguably the state's most competitive House race and may be a test for Republicans' appeal among Hispanic Americans. Latino candidates everywhere are campaigning on the merits of God, family, and country.
Dios, familia y patria. Que Dios me los bendiga. Gracias.
They're also promising to take a hardline stance on migrant crossings and illegal immigration, notably in states along the southern border. Mexican-born Republican Congresswoman Maya Flores is one of them. She's also a vocal opponent of same-sex marriage.
The Democratic Party has walked away from the Hispanic community. They've walked away from our values to cater to the far left, that is anti-God, anti-family values. They've abandoned our community.
These messages have resonated with many Latino voters, weary of the Democrats' progressive policies on family, religion, and immigration.
To be against illegal immigration is not the same thing as being against immigration. They're families, and they came in the way immigration is processed and supposed to be, legally.
Hispanic Americans make up a fifth of registered voters in more than a dozen hotly contested House and Senate races in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, as well as Texas. Of course, the Latino vote is not monolithic. The issues that dominate local elections, for example in Chicago, are not the same ones that influence voters in California or Florida. However, inflation continues to top the concern of all voters across the board. For now, polls indicate that Democrats are expected to win the majority of Latino voters. However, margins will continue to dramatically shift if Democrats are seen as undervaluing faith, family, and even small businesses. Many voters fled socialism in places like Cuba and Venezuela and detest the role of big government. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
Now, despite the strict zero COVID policy in place, coronavirus cases are creeping higher in cities across China. Beijing, which has some of China's strictest COVID barriers for entry, has seen infections rise after the National Golden Week holidays earlier this month. The capital also shut down one of its major amusement parks as part of its COVID-19 preventative measures. On Tuesday, Beijing reported 19 symptomatic cases out of 1,400 for the whole country. That's the highest case count for 12 days. The cities of Wuhan and Guangzhou also locked down some districts due to a surge of COVID-19 cases there. Wuhan, where COVID-19 first emerged nearly 3 years ago, shuttered its Hanyang district after a spike in cases. More than 800,000 people there have been told to stay home as services are limited across several sectors. Guangzhou classified 5 more of its districts as high risk. The southern metropolis and manufacturing hub had already shut down daily social activities and called for mass testing in 2 other districts. China's economic growth has hit a speed bump in the fourth quarter as COVID curbs limit travel and shipping, constrain consumption and commerce in the world's second largest economy. The XBB variant, which was first reported in Singapore, could become the next dominant strain of COVID-19 in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has already recorded 140 cases of XBB since an overseas traveller became the first known carrier earlier this month. According to experts at Hong Kong University, the population has strong levels of immunity against COVID-19 subvariants, including XBB. However, the potential of the XBB variant to drive up infections has already been demonstrated in Singapore. There, the strain fueled a surge to around 60,000 cases in 1 week. The authorities in Singapore now say that daily cases could peak at about 15,000 by the middle of next month. The XBB variant has now been reported in 17 countries internationally, including Bangladesh, Denmark, Japan and the United States. There are growing anxieties about it in New York State, where it is now spreading rapidly. Experts also found XBB to be the most immune-evading variant identified so far. The research revealed that the booster shots designed for the Omicron variant have lower efficacy against newer strains like XBB. Research further outlines the need for variant-specific booster vaccines in order to be as protected as possible against coronavirus. The United States, Japan and South Korea are warning that an unparalleled response will be warranted if, as feared, North Korea conducts a 7th test of a nuclear weapon.
Japan and the Republic of Korea are strong and close allies to the United States. Our commitment to defending both countries is ironclad, and we're clearly bound together by common security interests. All of this behavior, all of it, is reckless and deeply destabilizing to the region. We urge the DPRK to refrain from further provocations, and we remain committed to dialogue with the DPRK without preconditions.
North Korea has been carrying out weapons tests at an unprecedented pace this year. Pyongyang has fired more than 24 ballistic missiles, including one that flew over Japan. North Korea was unhappy with South Korea's military activities in the region and last week fired hundreds of artillery shells off its coasts in what it called a grave warning to its southern neighbour. In September, the USS Ronald Reagan and accompanying ships conducted joint military exercises with South Korean forces in response to a North Korean ballistic missile test. And staying on the Korean peninsula, South Korean Marines in amphibious armoured vehicles waded ashore as part of a large-scale military exercise. According to the organisers, it's part of a plan to prepare for any North Korean aggression. The amphibious landing exercise, held near Pohang on South Korea's east coast, is part of a 12-day field exercise that includes some drills with US troops.
We're conducting a practical and intensive training by establishing our own South Korean military landing operations plan and familiarizing ourselves with the procedures of the joint forces. Through this drill, we will maintain our strength and willingness to respond quickly to any situation, anytime, anywhere, when the mission is given.
Thousands of South Korean troops have been mobilized for the drills. North Korea has condemned them, saying they are raising tensions. South Korea and the US say the exercises are defensive and necessary for deterring the North. Finally from us today, news from the world of basketball. The Phoenix Suns condemned defending champions, the Golden State Warriors, to their second defeat of the new NBA season. But the ill-tempered game will be remembered for the first ejection of five-time All-Star Klay Thompson's career. Two of the best teams in the Western Conference locked horns in Phoenix. It was the host.
No, just two competitors. I mean, in my post-game interview, I said it. I love Klay Thompson. I have for a really long time, but that doesn't excuse us from being competitive and talking to each other. I've always admired his game. How he plays on both sides of the ball, and obviously the rings speak for themselves. But like I said, I'm gonna bring it every time.
It's not about the winning, it's about the taking part. We will take part in another edition of WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. again tomorrow, same time, same place. I hope you'll join us for that. Until then, stay tuned for all your news updates to WION. World is One.
Many other. This is right, Arab.